Welcome to episode 121 of Silver Lining for Learning. And for me, this is a special episode because it's going to take place right here on my campus, Indiana University, where I've been 30 years since I was eight years old. We have three guests with us from IU. First off, I want to mention Dr. Stacy Morrone, who I think I was kind of on the search committee to bring in 25 years ago, a quarter century ago, when she was hired as a visiting assistant professor in 1997-98. But it wasn't long before my colleagues at Indiana University saw something in her and made her executive director of the Teaching and Learning Center from 2002 to 2006, dean of IT at IUPUI, deputy CIO, in charge of the digital textbook project across IU and many other projects like what we call OnCourse, our learning management system, associate VP of learning technologies, all this stuff, and really in charge of all IT across all 9 campuses. And then they said, why don't you become dean of the School of Education? People, will like your ideas and thoughts and plans. So she's been the dean for 2 years. This is her 3rd year. Her interests are in technology-rich active learning environments. So welcome in, Stacy. And we have Tracy Birdwell with us, the program director of the Mosaic Initiative, which Stacy initiated a few years back, and we'll talk about. This is a university-wide effort for active learning space at IU. And like Stacy, she has an affinity for Delaware. Stacy started her career at the University of Delaware, and Tracy got her PhD in American history at the University of Delaware. Through insider knowledge, I got that, Tracy.
Go blue hen.
Mark Russell is also with us, the manager of learning spaces at IU. And as you can see, we take space seriously. While everyone else is looking out to the James Webb Space Telescope and the Artemis 1, IU is looking in and out. And SLL, Silver Lining for Learning, has not had a show on space. We are all about new models of education, the future of education, but we have not yet looked at the space in which this occurs. Here's our chance. We have a chance to look at hybrid, fully online, virtual, and physical spaces. And we do not just design spaces at IU, we research them and we promote them at conferences and summits. You might read about us in EDUCAUSE or Campus Technology or various other places. So Stacy's going to start us off with the history of all this. I'll try and grab some slides so she can jump in here. And
Thank
there
you,
we go.
Kurt.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So do you want to launch the PowerPoint? There you go. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of an introduction on how we got to Mosaic. And so I had been involved in creating a large active learning classroom. And actually you see it there on the slide down in the right-hand corner. And so we had this new classroom, and I'll say a little bit more about that on the next couple of slides. But what we soon realized that this is going to be a classroom where we're going to have to help faculty prepare to teach in this kind of classroom. It was like nothing that faculty had seen before on the Bloomington campus. And so, in fact, I think Tracy knows this story, that there was a faculty member who was expecting something very traditional. He walked in on the first day and said, oh, that's not what I thought. And I think that was just a little too much for him. So he ended up changing classrooms, but we had faculty who were quite excited about this, but we knew that we needed to do more to help support faculty in teaching in different kinds of classrooms. And so just a little bit more about the history of the word mosaic. So mosaic is not an acronym. Mosaic really came about. We were consulting with the University of Iowa. Jean Florman was teaching center director at that time. And she came for a visit, and we were talking about what we wanted to do and how we were going to shape the way that we should do this, because Iowa was a leader in this area, and it was doing a very good job with their tile program. So they were one of the earliest pioneers. And so we said, let's bring Jean to campus and let's talk to her. So she spent a day with our faculty, our teaching center, and at the end of the day, we had kind of a debrief. And I said, Jean, it's not that we have a tile classroom. We have thousands of classrooms at Indiana University that are general inventory. It's really that we have a mosaic of different kinds of classrooms. And so that kind of stuck. So it was a riff on tile, which really came out of the University of Iowa. So they get a lot of credit for inspiring us. So now you can move to the next slide. So this classroom, it was a swimming pool in its origins. And so this is a historic photo that we have from the IU archives. So then fast forward, this is that same space. And it was really my most ambitious first active learning classroom project. And it's evolved some from what it was before, but it remains a popular space. So this really is how kind of Mosaic began. And this is that kind of the history of that. So there's one more slide, and then I'm going to pass to Tracy. So one of the smartest things I ever did was hire Tracy Birdwell as the program director for Mosaic. And the very first cohort kicked off of the Mosaic Faculty Fellows. And Adam Finkelstein from McGill University was our keynote speaker. And the Indiana Daily Student, that's our student newspaper, ran this piece. So Adam kicked us off with a keynote that was attended by a large number of people. Certainly the fellows themselves, but lots of people across the university were very interested in this. Kurt, I know you were there. You brought graduate students. It was really a wonderful day. And then the Mosaic Fellows then spent I think about a next day and a half with Tracy, and Adam was there for part of that time as well. So we were off. And I'm going to now pass this to Tracy to talk more about the program.
And as Tracy's loading slides, I'll just say in the swimming pool, which is now an active learning classroom, we have speed dating with technology activities and many other things where faculty rotate around to different tables and learn about new technologies.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure before I get started.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to step back just a little bit. I am a historian, so I feel like I need to take a step back. And I do want to mention that these active learning classrooms that, Stacy was really the driver. I just had to start a new round of our Mosaic Fellows last week. And Stacy, I was talking about you a lot about how you really push for this to grow at Indiana University with others, but you were really the driving force. And what Stacy was seeing was what I would really label a STEM movement originally. Active learning classrooms, kind of as part of the conversation we're having, were really originally these classrooms called scale-up classrooms that folks at MIT and NC State were building. The original ones were for physics students. And so the idea was to take the lab and the lecture and put it together in the same scheduled space and create a classroom where the faculty could lecture and then have the students do the lab in the same class period. That means the students could do hands-on learning and instructors could see, get some feedback in terms of how far along students were in concepts and either support the understanding of something that students were struggling with or really help them move forward. So these first active learning classrooms, kind of really rebuilding the space, were these early STEM classrooms. And I like to say that because I'm a historian, and these early conversations sort of didn't seem to include all disciplines. Here we go. I just want to show you a picture live and let you know of another stakeholder in active learning classrooms. University of Minnesota was an early adopter. They built a whole building called Brunick's Hall of these scale-up classrooms. And these scale-up classrooms, I heard Stacy use the term cookie cutter a lot. They were the same build. So this whole building has classrooms. Every single classroom in this very large building, several floors, has a classroom that looks like this: a table of 9, with the possibility to group in 3s, with a screen per table and whiteboards per table. So the early active learning classrooms were one design. An example of tile, this is what Stacy spoke about, our good friends at the University of Iowa. They also created a bunch of scale-up classrooms. And what is significant about them is they developed this tile program to support faculty teaching in these classrooms. So instead of just sort of building classrooms and expecting faculty to know how to teach, the tile program really supported faculty in these spaces. And you had to go through a specific type of training for these classrooms to be able to teach in them. Now, what is significant about the tiles training is they had similar classrooms. And as Stacy said, we have a mosaic of classrooms, which would create some challenges in how we support faculty, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And this is really what sort of Stacy, with that transition from tile to mosaic in terms of concept and branding, frankly, really brought us to. We've got a variety of classroom builds. They support a variety of disciplines. As a historian, I kind of started to see myself in this conversation. Now, at the Indiana University, Indiana University wasn't the only one building a variety of spaces, moving away from the scale-up model. But I think it's fair to say, due to the scope of our 8 campuses, we were really building across the state a variety of spaces. And I want to show just a couple of classrooms so we can talk about it in this conversation. I'll just briefly talk about the Mosaic Initiative. And I just want you to all notice I labeled the classrooms. I'm going to show you 5, but I numbered them just for easy access in our conversation. So here is a classroom that really is a lecture hall that seats 104, but it's tiered so that 2 tables are on a tier. And so this is a classroom where there's a lot of students, but this row right here can turn around and make a group with this table. So each of these flat rectangular rows, the students can turn around and group at a table. Also, a faculty member can walk up and down and around the classroom to be able to get to every group easily. So if a faculty wants to lecture, ask the students to group, they can do that. And if the students need to create content or brainstorm or do something where their work needs to be really visible, they can do it up on these screens, as you can see happening here. And here's a second picture of the same classroom. Every single one of these pictures, the students are smiling and laughing, by the way. They're working, they're learning, but they're up, moving around, and they're engaged. I love to see the smiles. Another classroom, this is on the Bloomington campus. This was actually a remodel of one of the first classrooms that Stacy helped push to get built. And I like this classroom because it's a pretty low-tech classroom. A lot of the more recent active learning classroom designs have been really focused on less technology. And so this is a classroom that seats 48, and you can see the students have access to these whiteboards. And this is a computer coding class. And believe it or not, this instructor has the students code on whiteboards rather than on their computers to begin. So it's a really sought after classroom. This one's behind Mark, you can see, and Mark will be able to speak about this one. This is a brand new classroom on the IUPUI campus. It's called the Collaborative Theater. I love it as a humanities person because you can be speaking to your students in the middle. They all can see one another. I love the idea that you can launch a question to the audience and kind of step out of the middle as the instructor, and the students can really see each other and talk to one another. These beautiful curved screens make for easy sight lines for when the students are viewing the instructor and the content. And it's hard to see in the screen picture, but there's a lot of space between the chairs. So it is easy to move around in the class, and these chairs swivel. So it's quite easy to group. And we've got a research project on this classroom starting this fall. And here's another, as you can see, swivel seats. Classroom 4, and that's the one Stacy talked about, the classroom that was a map room and at another point in time, a women's swimming pool. This seats 96. And then like Stacy, I thought you were going to say this, and I love it when you talk about how you had this realization that you had 16 tables, and 16 could be 4 by 4, and each of these screens, all of the student screens can be pulled up at once in this large screen. And some up close. I love it. These are classrooms where students are literally getting up on the furniture to work together. So I love it. You don't see that in a lecture hall. And then finally, not a classroom, and I think Mark can speak to this, but recently on our IUPUI campus, which is located in Indianapolis, we built the Idea Garden, which is a student tech space. We have VR, AR, touch screens. We have VX robots now. There's a lot of technologies, and students can walk in at any time and use these technologies. And we have some brand new programming around these spaces. But I've worked in there for the last year, and it's just a really happy space. And then just to talk about what I do just a little bit, I don't build the rooms. Mark spearheads that sort of thing, and we can ask him questions about builds. But one of my jobs is to really be faculty facing and to support the faculty use of all these classrooms, to support research in these classrooms and faculty research in these classrooms, and to support classroom design by bringing in faculty perspectives and student perspectives on how they used a space to give to our design team. And probably one of the things that the Mosaic Initiative is known for is we have a faculty fellows program where I work with about a dozen faculty a year over the course of a year to think about teaching in space, to explore Mosaic classrooms, to transform their teaching, but also to inform what we do in our learning spaces across IU. And I meet with them in a variety of classrooms. We explore what it means to really reflect on teaching in a classroom space and how best to exploit our classroom spaces. And one of the big transformations with the Mosaic Initiative is that I think when we started the Mosaic Initiative, there was a sense of faculty needed to be trained to teach in a classroom, which is sort of easily, it's a little bit easier to approach that concept when all of the classrooms are the same. When there's one type of classroom, it's easy to, at scale, support a lot of faculty. But I was sort of a small shop, and I needed to support a lot of different classrooms on a lot of different campuses. And so one of the things that I really had to do was maybe expand our approach to thinking about teaching in space. So I don't really train faculty to use one classroom. I show them a lot of classrooms and get them to think about how they need to make small adjustments to their teaching to fit in any space. We make sure that the types of teaching approaches they have are flexible. So if one semester they've got screens and the next semester they've got whiteboards, they can make those adjustments. And to me, just as important as building these really exciting classrooms is to take lessons from those classrooms and start to ask, well, what's the least we can do to improve all of our classroom spaces? So ultimately, we can make changes that everyone has access to. And I just want to point out, this is the day that I made Stacy Morrone the happiest. She said she was happy that she hired me. But one day we had a design symposium with the Mosaic Fellows, and they were designing and creating classrooms of the future. And the architect's office sort of caught wind of this, and they wanted to hear about it. And Stacy, I've never seen you look more pleased with me. When I walked in and the architects came in, and we just had this wonderful day of faculty sharing, a lot of fellows and senior fellows sharing their experience with classrooms with a variety of stakeholders, and Mark and Stacy were there. And so I just wanted to share that.
So I'm going to just throw up our School of Ed library space, Stacy. We won't have time to talk about it too much because we want to ask you some questions. I'll throw it up on the screen just so we can have as a talking point later on. And I'm trying to find it within this.
Actually, Kurt, I've got it. Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, why don't you?
I've got it up.
Oh, I've got it here too. You see it?
Oh,
I've got it. Stacey.
You got it. You sure do. Okay.
So I'm just going to flip through these real quickly, and if Stacy want to mention a couple things in here.
So this might make you dizzy because when you move from one to the next, it's zooming in on particular parts because the space is so massive. But in a nutshell, this is a library that was 30 years old and it needed renovation. And so this is in my new role, I was able to kind of step back into something I had been working on with the School of Education to really think about this library space. So this will be a place for an experimental classroom. That's what you see at the top here. Mark can speak to more about that, but very exciting to have an experimental classroom space in the area, book discussion area, a makerspace zone, And if you want to zoom back out, Kurt, there's that part, it makes you dizzy. Spaces for collaboration. We had nothing in the library that would allow students to work together. So we are creating new spaces, and those walls are going up as we speak. So very exciting there. And then we have different zones. One of the things we do know is the students gravitate. That curved wall is floor to ceiling glass windows. And so the students love to sit by those windows, and we didn't want to lose that. But what we had was stacks that covered up those windows, very tall, about 10 foot, arranged in a very traditional way. We now have 4-foot stacks that are that are spokes. So you can see from the front of the library all the way to the glass wall. So it's going to be a beautiful and inviting space that will meet the needs of our students and to be technology rich. So very fun project for me to finally be able to finish stepping into this new role that I have, newish role that I have now in School of Ed.
And those of you listening later or watching this show later, IU School of Ed was set up with some federal monies to be and AT&T monies and whatnot to be a demonstration site for technology and education. And some of it got a bit dated. So we're trying to upgrade. I'm the chair of the Teaching and Learning Technology Committee. So I've been involved in creating that slide classroom in the porch that you saw in their meditation room. But Stacy and I and Mark and many other people are involved in the redesign of the library space. And it's real exciting. Maybe by January or February, right?
That's what they're on target. So yes.
So Chris is going to start us off with a couple of questions. Chris, you want to go ahead?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to start, because I know that there's much to be said about these innovative designs where all students are co-located. But the pandemic has raised another situation in which some students are co-located and other students are remote and coming in by video conferencing. And maybe toward the end of the program, after we cover the sort of all the students there scenarios, we could talk a bit about that. And now, of course, the company that used to be Facebook is pushing the Metaverse, where you would do the same classroom digitally and the students would have digital twins. And I'd love to kick that around a little bit too. But I think these are more downstream than what we might start with in terms of how students who are co-located are using these models that you've created.
So I can start us off. There's a question from one of our regular guests on the YouTube chat. But first of all, I mean, I'm just reminded of this quote from chat, first you design your buildings, then your building design you. And I was just, my question really was, like, are you seeing faculty take these spaces and do innovative things with them? Or is there a lot of support that's needed? Or is there something in the architecture that sort of automatically pushes your pedagogy away from sort of the standard model just because of the affordances of the space? So I'd love to hear something that you have about that. And then I'll follow up with the question from John Heffernan, who's a regular viewer from Ireland. So Ed, are you seeing like faculty sort of take to it automatically, or is there a lot of support that's needed to make that pedagogical change towards active learning?
I just want to understand your question. Are you asking, do they just automatically go in and start doing active learning?
Yeah, I mean, do you see that happen, or do they need a little bit of hand holding because of just, existing habits and practices, right?
I find that, faculty are all different and there are different, comfortability levels with activities. But, I was really surprised that early on to discover they're not even using, sometimes they're not even using like the whiteboards in the room. Like they know they're there and they know how a whiteboard works, right? You marker and then you write on it, but they just didn't like incorporate that. And so, and even in that one lecture hall that I showed you where the students could turn around and instantaneously group, I was talking to an instructor in that room. He had taught 3 semesters, straight up lecture, didn't know that happened. And you know how I taught him? I said, why don't you sit there, professor? Now turn around. And then the light bulb was like, oh my God, I could do that. I didn't tell them, I asked them to do it. And so that's actually one of the things. And I can put a couple articles in the chat. I don't know how that translates for YouTube.
Yeah, we can add them
but
to the website.
I do have an article talking about design principles where I talk about how I get faculty to use these spaces and some specific examples that anyone can just copy and use. But to me, the key is get them to experience the room and do it together in a group. Because, you know, there's going to be, if you have movable chairs, half the faculty are going to say, it's going to be a challenge for me to get students to group the chairs. And the other half will say, that's not a problem for me. Why is it a problem for you? And you get them talking and, you know, sharing ideas and getting excited about it rather than telling. So my goal is always to get them to experience. So I get faculty, when we get together, I give them an activity and we're at the whiteboards. Then I'll say, well, what happens if we had screens, right? So you should sort of get their wheels turning. My goal is to just develop a brand new lens that says, whatever I do, the space matters and it influences what I can and can't do. So let me figure out how I could use the space. And also I might need to hack it. Maybe the space doesn't work for me. Maybe I can, you know, bring a few things in or work around some obstacles rather than just sort of walk to the front of the room and sort of never go anywhere else. So I find experiencing the space and experiencing several spaces starts to just create that approach.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I would add,
Mark? Yeah, go ahead.
I would add, there's a lot of faculty who haven't been through the Mosaic program who end up scheduled in these classes either by request or surprise. This is the classroom you're in. So, you know, we offer your typical, we'll meet your faculty in the classroom, we'll show you how to use the technology. But we also have some support staff who have been former instructors, who have taught in the centers. So they're very familiar with the approaches that you need to take with the technology, that sort of the why you would use it, not how you would use it. So we can kind of cover both of those approaches from a support perspective for those that haven't been through the Mosaic program.
And I do work outside. I haven't just worked for the 125 fellows. I get invited to departments, graduate students. So just kind of, you know, come by invite. And we do create online resources for folks who use the rooms too.
Thank you. So I can go with the question from John Heffernan in Ireland, and he's actually asking this for the K-12 kind of a space question. Who his friend is now at a pub, so he can't ask for himself, but he said he will have him watch the video. But he said his friend is a deputy principal in a school that has a brand new building, which is a bit more flexible than a traditional school building in Ireland. So he was sort of curious, like, what are the kinds of things that they should be thinking about as they think about developing more active learning spaces? And I'm thinking, Tracy, some of these publications which we can put on the website could be useful. But coming, you know, I just love to hear, Stacy, from you, like, you know, if somebody wants to start something from bottom up, how would they sort of, what are some things to keep in mind? I think it's more than just space. It's also bringing people on board with a certain vision about what active learning can and should be. So maybe you can speak a little bit about your experience on that.
Yes, and Kurt can help me as well, I think, with that one. So what's interesting when I moved into the role that I'm in right now, to walk around our building and to see classrooms that are really very, very traditional. In fact, some of them are embarrassingly traditional, with furniture that looks like it was meant for a fifth grader, in terms of tablet armchairs that are ancient at this point. So Tracy's, she's seen them all over campus. Yes. So, so what we want to do with this experimental classroom spaces that we've created as part of the library is to really engage with K-12 to say, what should our teacher candidates be prepared to do as they come into the classroom? What should classroom teachers be thinking about, and what can our students bring to them with regard to new ideas for technology? So some of the technology that's being used in K-12 schools, we have very little of it in our building right now. And you would think, well, gee, why not? And I think it's partly the way that we're structured at IU, where general inventory classrooms mean that any discipline can be scheduled in that room. So they tend to not be particularly specific, but the experimental classroom space will be our space. It won't be, there won't be a there won't be a chemistry course being taught in there. So it'll be an opportunity for us to have that engagement. So it isn't that we should tell K-12 what to do and K-12 and K-12 will tell us what we need to do, but rather that coming together with K-12 schools to really talk about what's needed and then to make sure that our teacher candidates are prepared to enter into the profession with that kind of knowledge. And, if you think about it, kids grew up with tablets in their hands. They grew up in a digital world. And so that's really what children are bringing into the schools as well. It's no problem to read an e-text. Those of us who are older, we didn't do that. We still like physical books, some of us. And so, but kids, they really want the digital opportunities. So I think it's a great opportunity for that kind of engagement.
So we would like to have you share any links that we talk about today with, just send them to me and then we'll post them and we'll add them to the blog post. Those of you watching this show, you have 3 interesting things you can do. You can read their research that they've published. You can contact them because the emails are all there. And you can go to the blog post bottom of it. We've got 15 links already there in the blog post to many of the articles that they've already written. And so you've got an assembly of things that you can do and take action with after this show. I will say, Stacy, we had a show a year and a half ago with Brian Beatty, who's an IST alum, who developed the high flex model. And, Brian, as I've said before, his picture is on everyone's dartboard at home. Those of you that don't like high flex are throwing darts at it. So I have a question about high flex, but before I get to that, I have to let Mark add comments. Mark, you have any comments from all the stuff we've talked about? You haven't, and we presented. Was there anything you've been holding back on first?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'll just add to the last question. I think Stacy gave a great answer there, but just pragmatically from a space planning program, one of the biggest challenges we have when we open new buildings, and I've worked on a lot of capital projects, is the square footage allotment we allow per student. So oftentimes this goes through administration. They're thinking about butts and seats and revenue. And so they try to fit as many people in these spaces as possible. But you really need a program for about 25 square foot per student minimum for an active learning space, just so you can move all that flexible furniture and so you have room to circulate and perform activities in the classroom. I think that's really important.
So going back to high flex, which is Chris is going to get back to at the end of the show, but the alcove, which is in Woodburn Hall, I taught from it, and Stacy's husband, Michael, taught from it last year, as it is an experimental classroom. Stacy and Tracy and Mark, to what degree do you see faculty embracing the high flex model or not? What kind of challenges are you facing with such an approach? Because many universities across this country and other countries are starting to experiment with a high flex approach. What advice would you have for them to get more people being trained in it or accepting of it or savvy with the use of a high flex model? And along with that, could you tell people about the alcove? Stacy or Tracy, either one of you?
And Mark, you were deeply involved in the alcove.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so you might want to take a first shot at that.
Yeah, for sure. There was a lot there. So, one of the goals of the alcove, and in fact, the slide, the experimental classroom that's going in the education building as well, some of the goals are, to provide instructors with a space to sort of play with some of these emerging technologies, a place where they can go in and feel comfortable failing. They have a lot of additional support behind them that they wouldn't typically have in a classroom, direct lines of support while class is going on. At times, people are actually in the room prepared to support them. But it's experimenting with some of these new technologies and how to improve that high flex model. In the alcove, we've done things like we're doing camera tracking. We're using mic arrays to determine where the speaker's located and camera zones to sort of snap to that contextual shot of that quadrant of the classroom. So to try to get a little bit more production quality with these camera systems without having an operator in the room. And that's specific. That's even more true in the slide classroom that's going in the School of Education. Within that room, we've got 5 groups of 6 students for a total of 30. Everybody's got a collaborative display in the room. We've got very flexible infrastructure because we anticipate turning this space over more often than the typical classroom as we develop models that we can push out to the larger classroom inventory at IU. But so one of the things we've done in the slide is we've put in an ultra wide aspect ratio monitor. It's a 21:9, 105-inch monitor. And there's also going to be a Teams room built into this classroom so that instructors can start experimenting with Teams and Zoom in the classroom and look at some of these collaborative models and develop new strategies for teaching in these high flex models, because it's a very uncomfortable situation when you have the inequity from the remote students to the in-room students, and we feel like this really is an important problem to tackle.
So we have a lot of questions. There's a number behind me, and I have a follow-up. It's Tracy or Stacy, you want to add to that briefly, and then I'll ask my follow-up question. No?
I think on the ground, I'm seeing a lot of instructors not necessarily doing high flex, but recording more often. But I'm not seeing a lot of having students in a room and then students elsewhere. And then I think, and of course I'm sensitive to this because I'm so focused on the fact that we're building some really interesting tools that students can play with in the classrooms. It's a challenge when your students outside of the classroom don't have those tools. And so suddenly that shuts down what happens face to face. Like suddenly you can't use the whiteboard unless the instructor feels comfortable and has figured out how to use the digital whiteboard in the same way as the physical whiteboard, or they may just feel like it's only equitable to use digital tools. So I think that's going to be a real challenge, particularly in an active learning classroom, because we think of people being up and around and moving. And how do you give like an equitable experience? Because we do want to reach out to a lot more students. So I think that's going to be a support challenge more than anything. I think faculty are open, but who's making sure that it's really going to be productive?
Stacy, you have unmuted, so I assume you have yeah.
Yeah, and it's aligned with what Tracy and Mark have said. So when I was in my previous role, I was in that role, working very closely with Mark and team, because we had to pivot to online in March of 2020, just like everyone else had to. And so what happened is that we now have virtually every general inventory classroom. I don't think, Mark, we have virtually any that don't have webcams. And that was a big deal because we didn't have webcams. And so, placing massive orders for webcams and installing them in classrooms so that we could attempt to do something that would work in the fall. So we're a residential campus at Indiana University Bloomington. So there's a lot more face-to-face instruction happening now, but I will tell you that having that option, so we're still getting students who get sick, they get COVID, they get something else. They're not so sick that they can't participate, but we certainly want them to stay home and get well. They can still participate. Is it a great experience? No, probably not, but it is something. And I think the faculty are very aware of this and like the idea that we can accommodate students who can't be there for some reason as part of this conversation.
So Stacy, correct me if I'm wrong, just for people who are watching the show or in the chat, we use a lot of steel case designs. So if the people are looking for examples, they might look at the company steel case. Is that right, Stacy?
Well, and I'm going to pass to Tracy too. So our building, the School of Ed, is heavily steel case, but that is not true. We are we use a variety of different furniture companies at IU.
Okay, just thought. So my follow-up has to do with the research that you've done. and they've hired many my students, Tiffany Roman, Dabe Lee, Mena Ju, Merve Bazdagan, and Sadar. Many, and they've all been highly productive in working with you. What is your philosophy of doing research around these active spaces? I mean, how do you get so many publications related to the projects that are going on? It's, you don't just install, you actually do research behind it. Does the university pay for that? How do you get the funds to do all the research behind this? And what's the philosophy behind the research side of it?
Stacy, did you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I wasn't sure you were unmuted. So
I think we've got two different streams, so maybe
right.
we can
So
talk about hers.
I'll start, and then and Tracy is very active in research to this day on this. So Kurt's right. I actually was able to, and it was funded by the technology organization. We were able to hire graduate students who could help us with research on these classrooms, because we didn't want it to be the case of, this is a really good idea and we're going to build this classroom. And then the administration will say it was really expensive. Does it work? And we'd say, gee, I don't know. We didn't want to be in that position. We wanted to be able to say, with a very rigorous research program, are these classrooms working? So we hired IST students, instructional systems technology graduate students. I had a postdoc, Sardar Abaji, who was fabulous in his role, and also some graduate students from learning sciences. And the technology organization has paid for those graduate students, which was really important, and part of Vice President Wheeler's then Vice President for IT Brad Wheeler's view is that we must engage in the research in order for us to evolve these spaces and to find out what doesn't work. And some things didn't work. And that's part of what we've learned. And so one of the classrooms that Tracy showed was it's actually in a residence hall, and we overbuilt it. And we did things that didn't actually work. And I really thought that Mark, what are those called that came out of the wall that was going to take a picture of the camera? I forget the name of them now. I thought this was, what are they called?
Copy cam.
Copy cams. I thought that a copy cam was going to be the best thing ever. And it wasn't, because the students just took out their phones and took pictures of the board. So it was something that we didn't need, and it was overbuilt. And so we simplified that classroom. And so what Tracy showed you is a revised version, and it was also not equitable. We tried all kinds of funky arrangements with different types of furniture. And what we learned is that it didn't work. And so then we were able to redo that classroom in ways that would make it equitable participation. Tracy was deeply involved in thinking that through. We got advice from the fellows on what to do. And so it's also that beautiful, bring the fellows into the conversation and ask them to help us. So it was research, it was seeking feedback. And that was really a key part of what we did and what we still do to this day.
So Tracy, we just have time for a minute added to that, because we have many, many questions. You want to add briefly to that response?
Sure.
And I'm going to be quiet for a while.
My charge was to support faculty in doing research, and I do research. And by the way, I also have an IST degree, so I know how to research the dead and the living now. I have to use IRB for this kind of research, so one of my goals is to make sure faculty, I always tell them when we start, you're going to learn the basic literature of the foundational literature on active learning, but also active learning classrooms. You're going to understand the questions that were being asked about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and we can start talking about the questions that we can start asking. So they're thinking about research, they're reading about research on these classrooms while we're in the classrooms, and there's something new each week. And they are reading. I'm good at getting them to read. So I'm really happy. So I prepare them to research, and a lot of them begin researching. And then I have a couple of learning science students. I almost exclusively hire from the learning sciences. They came up to me at that event that Kurt came up to me and said, can we work for you? And they did. So I've always had some hourly support. Sometimes they hold office hours to support the faculty. And so I've just had some really good fortune, and we've had a lot of IU research that then other faculty read, and they feel like they can do the research too. So we've had some really great output from faculty, and of course I do research as well too.
So Young's got a couple of questions from the audience and his own question. Young?
Yeah, thank you. So this is this question. Don't be surprised. It's actually what I think is an interesting question. You know, I'm sure all of us right have been visiting a lot of schools, K-12, colleges, and wherever you go, you're always invited to visit their most innovative classrooms, innovative buildings. You know, so there's a lot of innovations in various ways. I remember actually many years ago, Punya, when I was at Michigan State, we built the Tech Center, Technology Exploration Center. I was actually invited to give a talk at a Steelcase, about learning. So we all know, in many ways, all these new innovations matter. People seem to like it. You know, who doesn't like, more beautiful building, right? You know, so you'll be in those places. And so my question really comes to this. Most probably is in terms of Stacy, you know, as a leader of a college or possible institution, when you do research or when you consider this, you know, I think Dazi, one of our regular listeners, asked the question about the theoretical underpinnings of this. But my question is a further kind of forward. When you have a lot of money, you can do anything you like. But if you have a limited budget, let's assume you have a limited budget. I think Indiana, you guys are not as rich as Chris's Harvard, but anyway, just let's imagine you have a limited budget. Would it fare better to hire more faculty members, to split the classes into smaller groups, for example? Would it be better to not rebuild all of this, instead have students perhaps work on, in a coffee shop in Bloomington, have you thought about other alternatives, that's possible, instead of trying to do this, which also, of course, I just have to add this because Punya and I, coming from countries, Punya is from India and I'm from China, I'm just thinking about how almost impossible to build all these fancy classrooms and fancy buildings. Again, don't take my question wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just asking you, from a leader's perspective, other better investments than what we have invested in.
So thank you for the question. And there's multiple facets to this question. So part of it is that classrooms are part of how we recruit students. So if we have parents and prospective students walking through the building and they see classrooms that really are not what they were expecting, or, our sister institution up the road may have nicer classrooms, for example. So this is a case where it is part of our recruiting effort to make sure that we are providing good technology, good classroom spaces for our students. So some investment is necessary to do that. But what we've learned, and Mark and I talked about this a lot as it relates to the experimental classroom spaces, don't overbuild because it's expensive and it's hard to undo. And so with mobile technologies, we can be more efficient, we can do more with less cost, and we can flip those classrooms faster as we learn more about that's not working. Let's move that out and let's try this. And so that kind of shift to mobile technologies, don't overbuild classrooms, brings down the cost, and while still allowing us to be able to recruit the students that we need.
Chris is going to jump in here. Chris?
So I applaud the work that you're doing, and I think that conducting research on this is very important because of not only not wanting to understand what works for whom when, but also in terms of Yang's question about, when does it make sense to take the same money and make a different kind of investment, which is a question we all too seldom ask in education. I think that there's a very rich theoretical underpinning for this, and it comes out of psychological engagement. One of the things that we know about large classes that are passive learning, teaching by telling and learning by listening, is that students become very disengaged. They may be physically in the room, but they're not mentally in the room. And experiential active learning of the kind that you're designing for, we know from decades of research is powerful in terms of having students be in the moment, engaged, actively interacting, and therefore in a better position for learning. So what I want to ask about is sort of two variants that I think are part of the frontier that you're looking at as you conduct research and you understand how to optimize the situations where all students are located. And you understand, as Yang is bringing up, when do you get to the point of diminishing returns? When would it be better to spend additional money on another kind of intervention?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'd like to move the conversation a little bit away from just saying we're building the classrooms and over to culture change. Because with the classrooms that we've just built now, if we don't build another fancy, classroom of anything we've done, we have engaged in a terrific amount of culture change across IU, because these classrooms that we've built have inspired different teaching practices, have inspired conversations about active learning, that have carried over to all of our learning spaces. Faculty who, some of the ones I work with really directly, they become sort of the evangelists to other faculty and bringing in new changes, all high and low. Like I always bring like a little whiteboard just to some of my events, and then people say, where did you get that? And everybody goes, I make Amazon apparently a lot of money doing that. So it doesn't have to be high tech, it can be low tech. I think that the spaces have inspired conversations that have changed teaching and have gone beyond even the people who teach in those spaces. So I don't know how you quantify, what's happening there. And I also, again, I want to speak to the fact that by building these classrooms, we've really started to change the conversation. And Mark can speak to this, better than anybody, about what's the least we can do to every space we have. Like, could we have markers in the rooms to make whiteboards in even the less fancy rooms more functional? Could we take out 2 or 3 chairs and make even a not very flexible room more flexible? So how can we take this money that's been spent, that I don't think we're going to be spending a lot anymore, and put it in all classrooms, so this is something that supports everyone. So yeah, I don't think that there's going to be as many large fancy classrooms, or high-tech classrooms being built in the future. And I think I shared an article that came out in Inside Higher Ed on Friday, and that really seems to be a lot of the focus is, and I'll make sure, Kurt, I'll make sure you get that. But I did put it in this chat. It's a really, Stacy, I'll send it to you. I don't know if you got to see it, but it's really promising in the future of active learning classrooms, and this idea that there's a lot more to it in terms of student retention, student learning in these spaces too, which means that we're investing in some things that are a little bit harder to put a dollar amount on.
Yeah, and I agree that demonstrations of concept, if you build on them, can be very powerful in terms of culture change and can have leverage well beyond the people who are directly using it. So yes, I think that that's a really good way to think about it. There's claims being made by people who portray themselves as experts in immersive learning, that the metaverse is here, and that superior to any physical classroom would be wearing a VR helmet and being in a purely digital environment with people's avatars interacting. That's a much more complex topic than we have time to cover here. And as someone who is actually an expert in immersive learning, I have a lot of skepticism about many of those claims, although there are some interesting things that can be done in purely digital environments that do have promise. Something a little less far future, though, is this issue of how you serve students who are not physically on the campus. And the world is now hybrid. And so it's not just saying, well, we need to help out those students who are some kind of minority. It's also saying students need to know how to function in a hybrid workplace And if none of their classroom experiences are hybrid, then they're not going to learn how to do that. So that is something that I think is a fairly compelling argument. Now, again, this is a longer conversation than we can have, but one of the things that I've talked about on this topic is something called the third room. And I learned about this from Aalborg University in Denmark when I was visiting there. They have very high level telepresence that they use for their music education, which is, they're renowned throughout the world at training concert level musicians. And those musicians typically are remote, and they have these very elaborate teleconferencing setups where you have life-sized, high-resolution people interacting with one another. And the phenomenon that they describe, the third room phenomenon, is that people end up psychologically feeling that they're in a third room that doesn't exist, a room in which both people are co-located. And that's a strong kind of psychological suspension of disbelief that goes on that makes the music learning effective. We need to think about third room issues with our remote students, because right now, typically they feel quite disconnected and they don't feel part of the room that the students are co-located in. The co-located students don't feel that they're part of that room either. The instructor typically struggles with how to handle the situation, and it is a difficult situation. But I think that that's a frontier that I would take seriously and think about, because it's not only kind of a fiduciary duty in terms of some of your student population. The hybrid working environment is very much a part of the world that students are entering now. And if you're sitting around a conference table and half of the participants are virtual because they're halfway around the world, and you don't know how to build that bridge to them, it's not going to have a happy ending. So there's not really a question in there, sorry. But I do think it's an important frontier to think about, because sometimes by optimizing co-located students, you're actually undercutting the opportunity to involve students in a hybrid learning situation.
So we only have a minute or two left before we're going to introduce the next show. Young's going to do that. Stacy, Tracy, Mark, you have a final comment that you'd like to make either on what Chris has said or about anything else that you thought of during the show?
I think any new models that we design, create, digital or physical, are really going to take a lot of support to move faculty or instructors, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, in that direction. I don't mean convincing them, I mean supporting them and being able to do the things that they want to do in any modality.
Thanks, Tracy.
And what I would say is, and this is a shout out to Tracy, is that our Mosaic Fellows, this is fairly rare, but Mosaic Fellows introduce themselves as Mosaic Fellows, and they're proud of that. And they're a thriving community. So there's 125 of them now. And once a Mosaic Fellow, always a Mosaic Fellow. And these are thought leaders at Indiana University. And these faculty do talk to each other, talk within their departments and their schools. And I think that this is what will be needed to help make sure that we continue to move forward in supporting. And Chris, you're right. The complexity is there. And how do we think about that, especially as a large, in our case, on the Bloomington campus, a large R1 institution? How do we keep moving towards that? So I appreciate the comment.
I think across both your comments is community building. Mark's going to have a comment, and if Punya has a final thought too, and then we'll go to Young. Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the themes here that we've talked about is cultural change. And while these rooms that Tracy showed in the slides and Stacy showed are beautiful rooms, they're very expensive, they're in high demand. The real impact with Mosaic is what goes into the low-hanging fruit of our general inventory classrooms. How can we look at those other spaces, take the lessons we've learned and apply them to those other classrooms? with the square footage allotment, with the whiteboards for students, with the opportunities to collaborate with different tools. That's where the real impact's made. And that does not cost a lot of money. That just requires stakeholders to think differently.
When you have any final thoughts?
Just want to actually add to something that Chris said, this idea of the third space. And I remember teaching this doctoral seminar where students were both from, this is before the pandemic. And what we had were these mobile robots, which is basically like a little TV screen, which you could move around. Amazing how much a sense of presence you could generate, because by the fact that you could sort of say you and you are in this group and this little robot would go and join a small group. It really did form a different kind of a community than you could have otherwise. So I think there are lots of possibilities in thinking about space now that we could almost be partially unencumbered by the laws of physics and civil engineering and so on, right? So, but I think it's an interesting space to explore and think about. But thank you again very much for joining us. I'm looking at the time. I appreciate all your insights. And on behalf of all the co-hosts, so thank you. Next week, same time, we have our hosts reflection. So that's every 4 episodes or so, the 4 of us together and talk. We never know what the conversation is going to be about, but I hope we can talk a little bit about these new AI systems that are coming out. If you look at the image that I made for next week's episode, it was generated by DALL-E by entering in some words, saying, I put in something and it created this image for me. There's a piece in Inside Higher Ed, I think, or recently about AI writing systems and how they are going to change how we think about writing in K-12 and higher ed. So I think some interesting explorations there, along with reflecting on the past episodes. So thank you again for joining us, and see you same time.